Welcome back as we go back to the NCOP debate on the implementation of the Domestic Violence Act. The chairperson of the Select Committee for Women, Children and People with Disabilities, Mrs. Berta Mabe, told the NCOP that her committee had made a number of recommendations with regard to the implementation of the Domestic Violence Act. The first recommendation was to establish a clear definition and understanding of the term imminent harm.
Legislative change is required in this regard, clearly defining the circumstances that it refers to. On the guidelines of monitoring registers, we recommend that there's a need to implement stricter monitoring guidelines in terms of the domestic violence registers and case follow-ups. On the interdepartmental collaboration, we recommend that there is a need to ensure a closer working relationship with other departments such as health and the Department of Women, Children and People with Disabilities. And on the training, we recommend that there's a need for a standardized training that is intensive and ongoing beyond the scope of the current 5-day training. This training applies to all officials dealing with domestic violence at police stations and family child sexual and offense unit.
Members of the NCOP highlighted a number of problematic aspects of the Domestic Violence Act. The Democratic Alliance said there appeared to be reluctance by the police to discipline members who did not comply with the act. The Independent Police Investigative Directorate referred 104 cases to the police between January 2011 and March 2012. No less than 75 cases are still waiting for some response from the SAPS.
The percentage of stations fully compliant, as we heard from a previous speaker, with the Domestic Violence Act remains shockingly low. Of the 263 stations visited, only 14% were fully compliant with the Domestic Violence Act. There are no statistics available to determine the number of domestic violence incidents that occur each year, as the SAPs clearly don't take the situation seriously. This makes it even harder to determine whether the situation is worsening or improving. Nor is there a record indicating how many of the people whose names appear in the domestic violence register apply for firearms, or indeed whether the designated firearm officer at the station checks the domestic violence register before handing out firearm licenses.
The recent case of a young mother, Tina Mbili, who was severely beaten by a partner in Verulam, Durban, is a sad reflection of failure of police to deal effectively with domestic violence cases. Besides police compliance with the Domestic Violence Act, they often lack skills in dealing with victims of domestic violence. Why is the police not enforcing protection orders against violent partners and arresting them in time before the women suffers abuse?
The empowerment of communities to uproot this scourge has to be centralized, has to be central. It needs the mobilization of the whole community. It has to be implemented together with a public awareness program that will educate the community about the nature of domestic violence, on how to deal with it, on how to identify it, where to get assistance, who to contact, about what remedies are available. This creates a role for all of us to continually engage the community at every platform to unite, mobilize, organize, educate, and empower them to deal with domestic violence and abuse.
Chairperson, despite general praise for the contents of Domestic Violence Act, there is a crucial area which relates to the usefulness of legislation in protecting rural women and women who live under customary law from domestic violence. The Act can only be enforced in magistrates' court or family courts. There is no provision for traditional courts to issue protection orders. Yet there are currently approximately 1,500 customary courts operating in South Africa. Socio-cultural, practical, linguistic, and economic reasons may limit the abilities of many rural women to access magistrates' courts while family courts function only in the urban areas. In 2002, Statistics South Africa estimated that approximately 15.5 million South Africans, representing 36% of the total population, live in tribal villages in the rural areas. A majority of the population in tribal villages in rural areas are women. In addition to the people living in rural areas, African people in semi-rural and urban areas may also adhere to the tenets of African customary law to a greater lesser extent. Honorable Chairperson, through the promulgation of the Domestic Violence Act, we have made significant progress in protecting those who suffer from domestic abuse. But as we reflect on the success of Domestic Violence Act, it is important that a clear message be sent to those who seek to prey on women, on the disabled and the elderly, that we will not rest easy until justice is not only done but is also seen to be done. Communities are therefore urged to help government to eradicate violence against women through reporting such crimes. Domestic violence in particular should not be treated as a private matter.
It's time for us to go for a break, and when we return, we cross to Pretoria, where Professor Somadoda Fikeni of the Heritage Council is on standby to talk to us about the troubled South African Heritage Resources Agency. Stay with us.